One company that's really not talked about enough was SpaceX. Up until SpaceX successfully launched and landed a booster, rockets were like fancy disposable lighters. This thing comes around, it literally comes and packs back down on Earth. Something massive has actually happened here. Maybe sci-fi is not all that sci-fi, and we are fortunate enough to live in the day and age where we get to see this start again. So today I wanted to do something that I'm interested in, something that I find very fun, something that I find way less talked about, especially now in tech, especially now with what's going on in the world. And I just wanted to kind of dig into it. So this whole started when I think I've been binging on a couple of like shows that, those feel good shows that you've been enjoying since you were a kid. So personally, I'm a big Star Wars guy. And very recently, there's one show called Foundation. And I find it quite interesting, but mostly because of like the themes around intergalactic travel. It's the standard sci-fi, and we're all used to that. We're like, hey, okay, this is definitely fiction. It is something that will definitely not ever happen. But I think the one question I had in my mind was, okay, maybe take a step back. What if it actually possibly happened? Like, how far away are we from that? And of course, that took me through a journey. I started looking at a bunch of companies that are doing good work in this space. And the top 25 companies by market cap, publicly traded company, are like over $400 billion. And there's a bunch of like private companies that are not listed, of course, that are well over that valuation. Guys like OpenAI and everything. But one company that's really not talked about enough was SpaceX. And so that piqued a lot of my interest because I was looking at how many unique companies are there in the top 25 in my book. And one that really stood out, it was not a big tech company, not doing chips, not doing AI, but really just stands out as a one of one among the top 26, at least, companies. SpaceX quickly became that. And I mean, I have a quick confession to make. The first time I watched like a SpaceX booster land, I was like, my mind was just going like, that Windows noise, the error noise, like what just happened here? Like, it's like my mind rebooted, because up until SpaceX successfully launched and landed a booster, like rockets were like fancy disposable lighters, like you spark them once, toss them in the ocean, and then we call it progress. But then this thing comes around and it literally comes and packs back down on Earth. It's like the rocket just went to space and, all of a sudden just came and landed in your parking lot, and you're like, oh yeah. That is actually, for me, I think the moment that was a bit defining. Something massive has actually happened here. Maybe sci-fi is not all that sci-fi, and we are fortunate enough to live in the day and age where we get to see this start again. The theme of today's episode, because I get to call the shots today, I want us to talk about space, and I want us to talk about the space race, but not just about touching space, but occupying it. And why are many countries sleeping on this? Why is the African continent, for instance, sleeping on this? And why I think it's extremely valuable, and everyone needs to get into this and get into it like as much as possible. And if you're a nerd, if you love sci-fi, if you love Star Wars, please stick around. Just watch it, give me a thumbs up and everything. At least tell me I'm not alone nerding out over space, because I find it very interesting. But again, why is the space race back? I've talked about it, like it's to occupy it. And it's akin to like when people want to claim the best lanes, the best parking spots, the best beachfront properties. Imagine we are going into a newly found, this is just land that we just discovered. the space race right now looks like the person who wants to grab the best property sets, as it were, in orbit and also beyond orbit. And here's the wild part. This era didn't start because a government like gave it like a rousing speech or something. It started because someone solved like one of the most boring problems imaginable about space, which is the price tag. Let's talk about Sputnik. Picture 1957, technically in October. Cold War vibes. They've just come off a war. I don't know what our fathers and our grandfathers were doing at this time, but all of a sudden you see something in the night sky, like just beaming past the night sky, moving fast. You can tell that's not a star. It's something different. It orbits Earth, and it makes a very terrifyingly simple sound. Like, just goes on beeping, 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 beeping continuously. And this is what the Russians did. The Soviets were able to achieve something that no one had done before. Basically launch an object into orbit, and it was hovering. And the question in many people's mind, especially post-Cold War, is like, these guys could just drop a nuke on us at any time. What are these guys listening in on? So imagine you're just chilling in your backyard, and suddenly your neighbor, builds a balcony that hangs over you. And, he's over your fence and tells you like, hey, what's up? I'm just checking in. Like, it's actually terrifyingly, it's a terrifying concept to wrap your head around, especially if you're a sovereign state, if you're a sovereign nation. And that's what basically the Sputnik movement felt like. It kicked off the original space race. And the Soviets had a really, really big, massive head start on this. Because immediately after this, they launched a dog. The dog was called Laika. And then shortly afterwards, they launched a guy called Yuri Gagarin to orbit the Earth. And I think the US felt really, really far behind. Then the president comes out, he's like, oh yeah, okay, we're going to make the moon the finish line. And then a couple of small wins here. But the big win really was Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong getting to the moon, landing on the moon. And then the Apollo mission finally succeeded. And all of a sudden, everyone was like, oh wow, we achieved the goal, we achieved the moon. And for context, at its peak, NASA, the ones that were really trying to get people and compete with the Soviets to get people over the moon, were taking up around 4% of the country's budget to just send someone over the moon. That's actually a bit crazy, because the mission was succeeded. They decided that the moon was the finish line. And a big photo op was done, and the flag was planted. Everyone now started asking themselves the question, okay, well, what are we paying for? Why are we even trying to do this? And so because of that, obviously cuts happen. A lot of cuts happen, which is the rational move to make. But then we now shifted into like a 40-year long nap of like space exploration. But many things like really, really happened that were pretty cool. Like, space shuttles, a bunch of space shuttles was done, were deployed. I think for context, there's one called Voyager. And if you're never even interested about anything to do with space, I'm plugging you onto this site. Like, just check out the Voyager journey. It's been going for 48 years. Right now, there were 2 Voyager missions that were launched by NASA in 1977. And these are actually what we credit for the photos of the Milky Way, right? And not Milky Way really, but the solar system. So all the planets, and right now it's already in interstellar space, still going. People estimate that maybe we still have like a couple more years, or maybe this year, when we'll stop receiving signals from it. But until then, we're still receiving data from those 2 missions that were launched. Is it 48 years now? 1977. Yeah, that's 48 years ago. Pretty crazy, right? So there were still some small wins. There was the Mars rover, the one that was launched into Mars, went on the surface of Mars. There were a bunch of probes that were sent here and there, a bunch of satellites that were sent, all amazing. But it went from like something like inventing the smartphone to more like upgrading a calculator. And why is that? Because space was actually still horrendously expensive to explore. It was too expensive in a way that you had to kind of shelve like your big dreams. And think about it this way. To get to orbit, right, you need to go insanely fast, like 17,500 miles per hour. That is like, I don't know in kilometers per hour, that's like over 20,000 kilometers per hour. That's not even car fast. That's like your face becomes a weather at this point. Like it's hurricane fast, And most of the rocket fuel is spent on just achieving the speed to stop failing to get your basically the vehicle, the rocket, into orbit. So it's really, really fast. It became very, very, very costly. And the cost per kilogram to send anything into orbit was somewhere in the range of $10,000, like per kilogram. That is, imagine if you needed to pay $10,000 to grab a flight from Nairobi to Johannesburg, give or take. It is extremely costly to travel to Johannesburg. That is the cost of sending 1 kilogram at the time in the 60s era into space. And this is where the Elon story kind of now it makes sense why SpaceX is the company that's very unique among the top 25, in my opinion, compared to others. Space needed an industrial revolution type moment so that somebody can actually begin to think again about what does it mean to do a space race right now. So this is early 2000, and I wish this story was not true, but Elon Musk was part of, I think these guys called the Mars Society or something, and his basic idea was like, I want to send a greenhouse to Mars. So he tries to buy a rocket, goes to Moscow. Then the rocket scientists in Moscow were like just laughing at him. They thought of him like as a rich kid over there who's just trying to do like a fun pet project. And then the guy actually became serious about it and was like, okay, fine, I'm gonna do this thing very much, Silicon Valley style, like, iterate, fast, fail, and everything. And I'll build rockets myself. Now, I'm not here to talk about Elon. I know he's a polarizing character. I don't want to canonize him or anything. But SpaceX managed to do something that is undeniable. They decided that a rocket should not be disposable. Because disposable rockets are like, imagine if you flew somewhere, but every time you flew with your Kenya Airways or your Ethiopian Airlines, the plane was discarded after every flight. He basically decided to challenge the fact of, hey, rockets must be reusable. And basically, because of that model really technically worked. And SpaceX basically said the question, what if rockets were more like airplanes instead of like single-use devices? And that reusability aspect solved for the biggest problem that basically attacked launching anything into orbit. So when SpaceX started to land boosters, that moment that I started with, the one that we saw a whole booster coming and landing on a particular platform successfully, it's not just about cool engineering, like in my opinion, it's also about economics. So remember, the original space race, the one in the 60s, after post-Sputnik, it was all about getting into space. And now this one is now about occupying it, and that's only possible because a launch for a particular rocket stopped costing like, it only required like nation state money to be able to fund this. And this brings in Falcon 1. Falcon 1 was the first rocket that SpaceX did, and it dramatically lowered the costs to orbit. In fact, I think the specific number by many estimates is around $1,300 per kilogram, which is orders of magnitude cheaper from the $10,000 that it used to be. And think about it this way. All of a sudden, my airfare stopped costing $10,000 per ticket to $1,000. That is a 10x improvement. That means everyone is now gonna, like, moving between one place to another becomes all of a sudden uniquely accessible to many people. And this is like my favorite analogy that I like to think about. So before shipping containers, back in the old days, like global trade still used to exist. but it was very slow. It was very fragile. It was very expensive. In fact, I'm a history buff. I love the stories about East India, Dutch East India, and everything about how early days, like how we are getting into this economic era. One thing, and a lot of devs will really, really love this. We all know about Docker containers, Docker and shipping containers, but the point is, I just had a moment by myself over there, and everyone in my class just missed it. But yeah, I hope there's another nerd out there. But anyway, containers, shipping containers. Let me not lose track. So all of a sudden, because of containers, you could now finally begin to move stuff like Lego bricks all around the planet. And basically that made the world economy go on turbo mode. And that's why companies like, Musk are like extremely valuable to this day. It's because just the idea of shipping containers completely revolutionized how we are able to move things around via freight, especially around the globe. And this basically added like the interconnectedness of many countries to be able to do trade. And what I like to analogize the SpaceX moment to be is like reusability of rockets is like the containers of space. It basically turns bespoke missions, which were initially like feats of investment before, to be something like a repeatable logistics. Like basically we can be able to do this. It's so crazy to the point where these days, at this point, I know it's probably not that epic for many people, but SpaceX just does weekly launches these days. They're launching rockets into outer orbit twice a week, give or take, and more. And once space becomes now a logistics question, the new question that now you have to address, and I think many countries need to start asking themselves, okay, where do we put our stuff? And now that's where the question of the space real estate comes in. Now, why is space really valuable? Here's the mind bender. Technically speaking, space feels infinite. Like you can go on and on and on and on. But the useful parts for us, especially near Earth, they're actually very limited. It's like the ocean. The ocean is very huge, yes, but the ports that we use to access the ocean are very, very limited. In fact, one might argue like one of the biggest issues about like Africa not being that deeply connected to like international and global trade is because of the lack of natural ports, because of the shape of our coastlines. Our coastlines are usually very smooth, so we don't have a lot of natural harbors. But when you go to Europe, when you go to the US coast as well, there's so many deep natural ports naturally existing that it makes it very suitable for them. And the moment you have a port, you have an access point. And the access means like basically the velocity of trade happening around you is massive. And that's the thing. Space is now like the ocean. It's huge, yes, but the ports are very, very limited. That means the valuable real estate that we have in space are very, very limited. And it's basically centered around 3 main value points right now for space. One I'll call LEO. It's not really, it is called LEO, low Earth orbit. The second one is geosynchronous orbit, GEO. And the final one is the moon. Who would have known? Though we like to say shoot for the moon, shoot for the stars, aim for the moon. Aiming for the moon is actually a very, very rational business decision any country can be able to make. But not even any country. Any private enterprise can be able to make. So let's walk it through. Like, why are these neighborhoods, as it were, very valuable? So let's talk about LEO for now. Low Earth orbit. So low Earth orbit is basically between the 300 to, is it 1,000-mile region just above the Earth's surface. That's around 500 kilometers to give or take 1,300 for my, London School of Business, aka former Commonwealth, English colonized countries. Any kilometers, yes. So this is basically downtown space, as it were. And it's where any object that's in low Earth orbit, like literally orbits the Earth around every 90 minutes, within every 90-minute window. So, what is so important about low Earth orbit? We've called it downtown space. But one, it's close enough to get very high resolution images. Number two, it's close enough as well for very low latency communication. And number three, it's cheap enough to reach relatively often. And many people know this of SpaceX. It's actually where Starlink lives. And this is how I begin to tie it into like actual economics happening right now in the world. Now, Starlink is a huge deal. Not just because it's internet from space. I mean, that's awesome. That's amazing. Yeah, we have internet. Everyone has broadband. Everyone has massive fiber internet connectivity. But it's because SpaceX was fast, it literally meant that they could pick the best building height for basically Starlink and the Starlink network. So something to keep in mind is the thing about being on low Earth orbit is because you're very close to the surface of the Earth, you can't necessarily see the entire globe. And so for you to be able to really cover the entire globe, you need like almost like a network. You need like a concert of satellites around the orbit, the low Earth orbit, for you to literally have reasonable coverage. And because of, let's go back to reusability of rockets, that makes launching a belt of low Earth hanging satellites much, much cheaper than ever before. And you know the way in an apartment building, like, you know, floor 20 has a nicer view than like floor 2. The same thing happens with low Earth orbit. Like altitude matters. Performance, interference, latency, especially when you need to do communication. And Starlink did, of course, what every fast mover person would do. You get there early, you stack thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit, and you make it very hard for competitors to tack underneath you without headaches. And let me give you like some context. And it's maybe like a small tangent, but it's very important to occupy low Earth orbit because space is also like a bandwidth fight, especially in the low Earth orbit area. Think about how your telco company operates in a particular nation. Telcos necessarily pay for specific spectrums. Now, when you're the first person to necessarily exist in a particular area, you get to bulldoze like, hey, this is what I want, this is where I want it. And just because of that, SpaceX was able to literally pick the best frequency. And one thing to kind of understand is that when data goes up and down from satellites, it uses radio frequencies, right? It uses a particular spectrum. On Earth, many governments auction spectrums for billions of dollars. In fact, it's a massive economic space already. And in space, because nobody necessarily is there, there's a big first come, first served vibe layered, especially with the international coordination. There's a body called ITU and all these things. So it's not just where your satellite is that's important, but it's also what frequencies it gets to use when you're there without interference. And if anyone wants to build a project above you, Amazon has a new project like that they just did their first reusable rockets, I think, a couple of weeks ago, which is also one thing that inspired this segment. But they can't use the same frequency, and they cannot interfere with the same frequency that Starlink is on. And that's why being first mover became absolutely ginormous for them to be able to do it. And let me not even get into the military implications, because they are extremely enormous. You guys know there was a fight between Russia. Well, there is a fight still between Russia and Ukraine. Typically, countries like Russia would jam communications. They would jam. They would spread propaganda. They would block frequencies for countries that they are fighting against. And because of something like Starlink, you actually technically can't be able to jam communication. You don't control the frequencies. You do not control the satellite network. I believe we've been here We've seen a couple of things that have happened even on the continent when wars break out, when countries decide to, block ISP connections. You can still be able to do this with satellite communication. And so this is massive. Low Earth orbit, massive real estate, massive opportunity. You can essentially put many satellites, and you can have a belt of satellites just orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes. It only takes 90 minutes to orbit the entire Earth. These things fly by very fast. But let's talk about the second part of the real estate that's very interesting. Geosynchronous orbit. So now this is the penthouse area of space, especially as it concerns Earth. This is about 22,000 miles up, so almost twice the distance from the farthest end of low Earth orbit. That's around maybe 28,000 kilometers. But here's the kicker about being in geo. If you put a satellite on the geosynchronous orbit, it stays there over the same spot on Earth. It's basically a satellite that's locked to a particular longitude. And the reason why that's important is because that's how communications happen still. Weather monitoring, how do we flag for things like hurricanes? It's because there are satellites up there in geo. How do you do persistent surveillance over the same spot? So because geo is like the penthouse of space, like it's very heavily congested. Because they're very high value areas. But here's a creepy modern example that happened, especially from some research that I did. The Chinese folks placed a satellite in stationary orbit east of Taiwan. Reportedly, like this satellite was just basically affixed on the country that pretty much they are antagonists at this particular point. But the imagery from it has like such high resolution. You can be able to track any object between like overnight and day, and even with cloud interference. So you can imagine the level of military like arsenal that you can be able to deploy, especially in this particular context. So geo really, really does matter. It's essentially like a permanent rooftop camera. It's like you have a permanent CCTV. If low Earth orbit is downtown, geosynchronous orbit is a private penthouse with a panoramic view of whatever your target is. But there's still one more neighborhood that's a bit weird. And I'll take it back to the analogy: shoot for the stars and land on the moon. The moon is the final and massive real estate, and for many reasons. Before, in the space race, the moon was treated like a trophy by itself. We went, we saw, we conquered. It's really nice. But because of what companies like SpaceX have done, now we ask ourselves the question, okay, wait, there are resources on the moon. There's valuable minerals that can be mined. And the big one there is water. So in the south pole of the moon, in an area similar to the size of Switzerland, there's actually frozen water. And water in space is like a Swiss Army knife in Bear Grylls episode. Basically, you can drink water, you can use it, you can separate hydrogen from oxygen, and you have rocket fuel. Like water is everything, basically. You can use it for radiation shielding. And most importantly, you can use it as fuel. I talked about splitting hydrogen and oxygen, and you get liquid propellant. So what does the moon actually become? The moon now can essentially not only become, because there's also things like helium, which is also valuable, and some rare earth stuff, but essentially it becomes like an outpost for further exploration. So when you think about it, it's like now we have a gas station out of Earth. And that's why this becomes like really, really massive. I like to think about it like, so the moon right now is like the Carrefour of space. I don't know what's whatever is a relevant supermarket chain reference in your country, it is like that in space. Hear me out. You pay a membership, quote unquote, you get infrastructure there, and suddenly you can begin to buy fuel and supplies in bulk without hauling everything from Earth's deep gravity every time. So not only have we achieved reusability of rockets that makes space exploration super cheap, okay, not super cheap, but much orders of magnitude cheaper, we can actually now use the moon as well as an outpost to refuel. So deep space missions are now much more exponentially realistic. And I don't know about you, if you think about Han Solo, if you think about space, if you think about sci-fis in general, that just makes the kid inside of me like super excited. But here's one big massive problem that I think about every time. And this is the problem about, Africa, the continent, being left behind. Truly, if you really are never present, you technically don't have a seat at the table. I don't want to get political here or anything, but when you think about things like the UN and veto powers, it's no wonder certain countries, especially on the continent, have no say over such things. And this is a wake-up call, right? If you are not there in this particular endeavor, you essentially don't have a seat at the table. We'll be relying on proxies and things like that. So if you're not there, you don't make the rules. And in a world where location gives access to resources, presence actually is power. So the big question now becomes, how do you move enough stuff to actually build anything on the moon? And this is why I want to end with where I started. SpaceX. I don't know about you guys, but there's this thing called Starship, which is essentially a ginormous rocket. Think about it, like 8 bulldozers can fit inside this rocket. And the payload capacity for it is massive. And it is also reusable. So basically, in plain English, Starship now is not a sports car. It's not a sports car rocket. It's a moving van. This is a container right now. And we have this very valuable rocket that's just come, into employ right now. And if you can be able to move volume and you can be able to move chunky things like now thinking about habitat modules, power systems, drilling equipment, heavy rovers like in outer space, it's actually feasible to now move these things into the moon, for instance. And that's how you begin to actually build a base. So the sci-fi movies that we used to watch, I mean, it's still happening, and we are finally like alive to actually get to see this. So the real question here becomes, I want to now zoom out and maybe just take like a quick macro view. The first space race was a sprint that was driven by fear because of Sputnik, and a lot of pride because countries wanted to be the first to get to a particular place. But this new one is actually a very rational economics decision. It's driven by economics. It's driven by strategic advantage. It's driven by a lot of tech momentum as well. And honestly, it's a call for dreamers and a lot of human ambition. And it's now the question of, what do we do? What do we build when we get there? And for me, this is where now things become a bit fun and a bit more personal. Because I think colonization isn't just about astronauts and billionaires anymore. It's about supply chains. It's about energy systems. It's about communications. It's about strategic advantage, governance. Yeah, and maybe it will look like who has the beachfront spot on the moon as opposed to who doesn't. Because the future of space is actually very within reach, very much within reach, and it's very extraordinary, hilariously mundane, right? And it's boring because for many people, who would ever really think about like a rocket landing? And so next time when you see a rocket that's successfully landed to the moon, is a project coming up that I'm very keen on. The nerd in me is geeking out, called Artemis. But when you see another booster landing, don't just think, oh wow, it's cool. Think, okay, that's actually a reduction in cost. That is a massive reduction in cost. Think that's a shipping container. That's logistics. Think that's infrastructure. And somebody somewhere is reaping a lot of benefit. That's the boring sounding miracle that's actually happening, that's unlocking, in my opinion, something that's a very exciting chapter in humankind in general, occupying space. So, and we're live, guys, for the opening moves of what that looks like, which is kind of insane, right? So anyway, if you enjoyed this one, stick around. Evans will be back here for more boring AI slop that he'll be bringing on. However, I hope I indulged you and bored you a little bit more to just think a little bit outside of the box. And why is space interesting? And why don't we have a seat on the table yet?